I'm Dante.
And I'm Tommy.
And you're listening to Twigging On to Twig, a podcast where we talk about Wildbow's most under-podcasted web serial, Twig.
In today's episode, our very, very first episode, we introduce ourselves, we tell you what to expect from this podcast, and we share our initial thoughts about Twig.
Yeah, so I'm pretty sure that most of our listeners have heard of Twig and know who Wildbow is.
One would assume so, yeah.
Yeah, but on the off chance that you're listening to this and you do not know, Twig is a novel, specifically a web serial, by Canadian author J.C. McCrae, who goes by the online moniker Wildbow. And it's a great book, I assume. We haven't read it yet. That's what this podcast is about.
Well, full disclosure, we both have started it just a little bit. And
That's
then
true.
Realized it'd be interesting. This is the least podcasted work, as Dante said at the beginning. So we thought it'd be fun to share our thoughts as we go along and hopefully bring a few of you along with us.
Yeah. While we're on the topic of what is Twig, the title of this podcast is Twigging Onto Twig, and that might be a turn of phrase some people aren't familiar with. Tommy, you came up with that phrase. What does twigging onto twig mean?
Well, it's an archaic phrase. I think it's probably informal, old-ish British for grokking something, which is also semi-archaic and means understanding or catching onto something.
Is grokking archaic? I thought it was like a sci-fi term.
I am pretty sure it's a hippie term, but I would not swear to that.
Something to look into later, I guess.
I suppose.
Actually, I'm going to look it up right now.
Okay. So while you're doing that, Twig is the third web serial written by Wildbow, following Worm with part of the Parahumans universe and Pact, part of the Otherverse. Twig is the only one so far that does not have a sequel yet, but considering Wildbow is in the middle of maybe end, somewhere along those lines, I won't pretend.
He's only just barely starting.
The prologue is done of Pale.
Yes.
And we're getting into the real meat of it. But yes, so that's essentially what this podcast is going to be about. It's going to be us analyzing, reading, enjoying Twig on I believe, bi-weekly schedule. Our goal so far is to do 1 or 2 chapters per episode. I think, Dante, you had some initial thoughts about the structure we were hoping to employ.
Yes. So essentially, what we're planning to do is, instead of going through the story beat by beat, just kind of like chronologically, we're going to try and break it down and explore some of the various aspects of the story that we think are interesting. So we'll have a look at the story plot itself, what's happening in the story and where that's going. But we'll also take a look at like the characters specifically. I've been told that Twig is one of Wildbow's strongest works in terms of characterization.
Which is very exciting to read.
Yes. And then finally, like a focus on world building and the way Wildbow is building this setting in this genre that he hasn't explored before in his other works.
And in addition to that, we're going to talk about, anything we might find interesting that doesn't fall into the other categories.
Pretty much, exactly. Oh, I found out what the deal is with grok.
Please tell me.
So it is both 60s and science fiction. It's from the 1961 sci-fi novel Stranger in a Strange Land.
Okay.
So that's a book that I've never heard of, but I assume it was popular if it had that much of an influence on the slang.
Familiar to me, but yeah, I don't think I've read it.
Okay.
Well, I guess that might be one to suggest for the reading list, or the book club on the Doof Network.
Yeah.
All right.
All right. So, yeah. So that's what we're doing for this podcast. As Tommy said, we're going to try to do an episode every second week. We're going to try and cover 2 chapters in every episode. So that'll be 1 chapter a week for reading speed. And we want to kind of take it slow because, we're also reading along with Pale, and we're also listening to all the other podcasts about Wildbow's works that are coming out. And we don't want to be so overloaded that we have to, do nothing else and lose sleep to keep up with everything.
Or overload anyone who's following along with us.
That is also true. We don't want you to think that you don't have time to read Twig and listen to us just because you're doing other things.
Exactly. So, do you want to introduce ourselves, I guess, to listeners?
Yeah. So, we're random nobodies on the internet who happen to be fans of Wildbow.
We both live in the same city, which happens to be Wildbow's hometown. This is, public knowledge, not doxing you, Wildbow, if you're listening.
Yep. I'm told that he doesn't live here anymore, so I'm not likely to run into him at the grocery store. Although Ottawa's a pretty big city, so that wouldn't be likely even if he was
probably not
living here. So we're both living here. We've both read all of Wildbow's works except for Twig.
And the last little bit of Ward for me, unfortunately. I was in the middle of it when I was moving and then kind of lost. I need to get back to it. It's on the list. It's on the bucket list there. Pretty far. No spoilers, obviously. Actually, that's something I wanted to add to our notes in the future. And say that, this is going to be as much as possible a spoiler-free podcast.
Yes.
For other fiction, for other Wildbow works, and Twig up until or after the point where we have read. Obviously, it is a full spoiler for Twig up to our current chapters.
Yes.
And anyway, so this podcast sort of came together as an idea. Dante suggested it. We were at a meetup in Ottawa organized by Dante, and we're talking about Twig over a clock of beer.
Yes. We were at this delightful bar that they served a flight of 12 beers arranged around the clock. I don't know if they intended it to be themed around times of the day or if they just thought it was a nice way of arranging it, but it was pretty cool. A little bit other-versy, in my opinion.
It definitely felt that way, yeah.
Which was for the better. I commented that we had both started reading Twig around the same time, both started posting our thoughts about it online at the same time, and we're kind of at the same part already.
You're a bit further ahead than I am, but thereabouts.
Yeah. So I said, why don't we join forces and compare notes? And nobody's done a podcast about Twig before. And we live in the same town, so it'll be easier for us than for most people.
Hopefully.
Hopefully, yeah. So let's team up and do a podcast and see how it goes.
And here we are.
Yeah.
Great. Okay, so you mentioned that both of us have read a bit of Twig so far. One of the things that I do want to emphasize is that we're planning on approaching this podcast in a as spoiler-free manner as possible. So trying to approach each chapter as far as we have read it, insofar as it stands, alone without having context from future chapters.
Yes. Sorry, go ahead.
I was just to say, as much as that is possible.
Right. Yeah. So we're going to try not to spoil anything that we've read of Twig, but not included in the podcast so far. I've read about as far as arc, I forget, 6 or 7. I think you've read a bit further than that, haven't you?
No, I'm somewhere I'm at the end of the second arc. I was looking back to see. Much further back than I assumed I was.
Okay. Well, great. That means we'll get to the unspoiled territory for you that much sooner.
We get to do that whole that format that seems to work so well of one having read and the other not for a short while.
Yes. Yeah. So that's actually something interesting because in this podcast, I think we're going to have a few shifts of how we approach this book. Like right now we're starting out with arc 1. We've both read arc 1 already. We'll get to arc 3. I'll have read it and you haven't read it. Then we'll get to like arc 8. Neither of us have read it. I'm also primarily reading this through the audiobook. Kim Dauber has put together an audiobook of Twig, and she does a really phenomenal job, but she also takes her time about it because
quality work takes time.
Exactly. So she has not finished that. So we're also going to get to a point where I get to as far as Kim Dauber has released the audiobook, and I'm going to have to switch to text. And maybe, I'm not sure, but I would expect my understanding of the book or approach to it might change at that point as well. So we'll probably have a few shifts along the way.
I'd actually
be it'll be fun.
Really interested to see when you get to that point how your interpretation and understanding of the book shifts. Whether or how much the medium you're consuming it will impact how you're enjoying it.
We'll definitely talk about it at the time, because that'll be a pretty major shift for me.
And speaking of shifts, I don't expect this to be a big issue for the creation of this podcast, but I am expecting a baby, so at some point that will likely
congratulations.
have an impact on some of the scheduling, but hopefully not too much.
So bear with us, and we'll try and make it as seamless as possible, but we're exploring uncharted territory here. Neither of us have done a podcast before as well, which is also worth mentioning. We'll see how this goes.
So if we're rambling a little bit, apologies.
Or maybe you like rambling, in which case...
tell us.
Let us know, and we'll ramble more.
Correct.
All right. So anyway, we thought that in this initial episode, since we're just kind of like introducing ourselves and the podcast, maybe we thought we'd have a look at just kind of Twig as a whole, as, you know, the sort of thoughts on Twig before having read it. Like, what do we know about it? Where does it sit in sort of the field of things that we've read and things that the Wildbow fandom has read?
All right. So do you want, I had mentioned maybe reading the intro on the About page on Twig, just a sort of a setup for that. If anybody any listener has not read Twig yet and wants to, join with us, you can find that at twigserial.wordpress.com.
Mm-hmm.
The opening page or opening intro to the story is a short 2-chapter blurb setting up the story, and it reads as such. The year is 1921, and a little over a century has passed since a great mind unraveled the underpinnings of life itself. Every week, it seems, the papers announce great advances solving the riddle of immortality, successfully reviving the dead, the cloning of living beings, or blending of 2 animals into one. For those on the ground, every week brings new mutterings of work taken by stitched men of patchwork flesh that do not need sleep, or more fearful glances as they have to step off the sidewalks to make room for great laboratory-grown beasts. Often felt but rarely voiced is the notion that events are already spiraling out of the control of the academies that teach these things. It is only this generation, they say, that the youth and children are able to take the mad changes in stride, accepting it all as part of day-to-day life. Of those children, a small group of strange youths from the Lambsbridge orphanage stand out, taking a more direct hand in events.
Dum dum dum.
So there's actually quite a bit to unpack in this intro.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Sure. The first one that I want to point out is there is a subtle title drop in this intro. The list of new great advances includes the cloning of living beings. The word clone itself derives from ancient Greek, and I'm not going to attempt to pronounce clone as the ancient Greeks would have, but it literally means twig.
Oh, really? That's pretty cool.
As I understand it, the etymology of that, and probably why Wildbow, one of the reasons, because Wildbow is always having many reasons for choosing a particular title.
Mm-hmm.
But one of the main reasons that the word twig exists is because of the practice of grafting in agriculture. So I'm not sure how familiar you are with grafting, but in agriculture there are especially fruit trees. One has a specific trunk that one uses that's a particularly hardy, for example, apple tree, and one can graft other apples or other twigs of apples trees onto that trunk to grow that varietal while still taking advantage of the, say, hardiness of the parent tree.
Okay. So this is essentially like early cloning.
As much
because
as
it was first done essentially with twigs. And this is the other way around. We're getting the word twig
from clone
because we're using cloning in the story.
Exactly. At least I'm assuming that's where this title comes from. So another thing that I wanted to point out, and again, tell me if I'm barging ahead too fast.
Barge away.
is that this is explicitly a biopunk setting. It's a biopunk story.
Okay. Yep.
And go ahead.
Go ahead.
All right, and biopunk as a genre is a subset of the punk genre, which has a certain different general characteristics. The main tropes of which are dystopia, generally characterized by a level of social control and oppressive power structures, and groups of rebels, very often in fiction, children, punks, rebelling against the power structure. Biopunk generally uses genetic engineering and access to medical and genetic engineering as tools of oppression. And usually it's not very subtle dichotomy between, the haves and the have-nots, the rich, immortal people living on their little cloud, and all the peasants squabbling in the dirt amongst each other. There's always those images of those 80s movies with the rich, all those dystopic 80s movies where the rich people are living in the high rises, and then all the poor people are in the slums. And that's just generally characteristic of a punk genre.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so we kind of have both of these aspects explicitly called out here. We've got like the power structures. It says that the events are spiraling out of control, and the academies are sort of the authorities that are.
Yeah,
I have to come up with a way of phrasing that. The academies are the powers are the. What did you say?
The oppressive power structures?
Oppressive power structures, and things are spiraling out of control because of presumably the young generation rebelling against them. And then you also get the other aspect of biopunk in terms of, explicitly called out the biotech, the stitched patchwork creatures, the lab-grown animals. I thought it worth noting that these stitched patchwork creatures, that's pretty much exactly what Frankenstein started out with at the very beginning of the biopunk genre. Started out with this sort of patchwork, stitched people. So we're digging our roots deep here.
And I thought that was an interesting point that you brought up in the notes, that the stitched men exist in 1921, because I believe 1821 is the year Frankenstein came out. I might be gainsaying myself right there, but I believe never mind. 1818. I gainsaid myself. Wonderful. Well, it's close to a century, a little over a century, as Wildbow has said, since that date where the Frankenstein's monster was created, presumably by Frankenstein.
The famous movie came out in 1931.
After
I don't know if that's relevant, but it is possibly interesting.
Sure. Yeah. But I guess the little over a century after the creation or the publication of Frankenstein is specifically called out, and a singular great mind. I also wanted to note that the concept of stitching, creatures and bringing back, Frankenstein-type monsters feels very different in scope than solving the riddle of immortality or cloning living beings.
That's true.
I guess it might just be presenting a sort of sense of history. These first original works were crude Frankenstein's monsters, but now they're doing much more subtle work. They're doing... Or
vice versa. I mean, it doesn't really give us that much detail.
That is true. Mm-hmm. So going in... Oh, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say the other thing that I thought was interesting in this about section is just like the way he phrases this, only this generation that the youth and children are able to take the changes in stride. I feel like that's something that, this takes place in 1921. I'm pretty sure they still say that now with modern technological advances and
absolutely
smartphones and the internet and social media. Youth and children are the ones taking the mad changes in stride. This is, I think, going to be a very modern day relevance, despite the fact that this is set over a century ago at this point.
Undoubtedly. And what year was Twig actually written? 2015, I believe?
Yes.
Okay, so little under a century at the time of writing itself, but still very timely from this opening.
Absolutely.
And I think you also wanted to talk about Twig in the context of other Wildbow works.
Yeah.
So vague spoilers coming up for general themes and tropes of most of the other works.
Yeah, so I was thinking, since we've read other works by Wildbow, but not Twig, I think that it would be interesting to think about some of the themes and stuff that Wildbow talks about in his other web serials. I'm going to try and keep this as spoiler-free as possible, but if you're really sensitive to spoilers, maybe skip ahead 5 minutes, but really sensitive because I'm not going to spoil really anything. So I want to go back to what you were saying when you were describing biopunk as a setting.
Sure.
You mentioned the two main tropes of biopunk are essentially bio and punk, the genetic engineering and medical aspect of it, and then the dystopia and the oppressive power structures. And I want to highlight these two things because those are the two themes that come up again and again in everything Wildbow has ever written.
Absolutely.
So first of all, I said genetic engineering. Specifically, I think the term that best suits it is monsters. In the Parahumans universe, there are monstrous capes. That's not a spoiler. But there are monstrous.
Tell yourself that.
So there are people who are physically monstrous. There are others in the other verse, physically monstrous. But you also have people who are not physically monstrous, but are monsters in their personality. You have people who are deeply evil. You also have people who are just and you also have people who are annoying, and you have people who are really kind and wholesome in one way, but really deeply flawed in another way. Pretty much any way you could think of somebody as being monstrous, Wildbow likes to explore that concept.
And that is especially interesting in the context of existing biopunk, in that very often the antagonist is the CEO of the mega corporation that's replaced government as a ruling entity, and very often that CEO is not physically or outwardly monstrous until his hubris gets the advantage of him, and the disease that he's engineered ravages him, turns him into some monster for the hero to physically distorted monster for the hero to beat up or throw into a pit of acid or whatever.
And especially we were talking about Frankenstein before, there is this popular discussion about Frankenstein, about who is the real monster. Is it Frankenstein's creation?
Was you all along,
or is it Victor Frankenstein himself,
or the mob of villagers showing up with pitchforks and torches?
And that's actually a question that we do see in Wildbow's other works. Who is the real threat? Who is the real monster? You see these phrases come up again and again. I think this is going to be probably the most important question in Twig. Who is the real monster? Absolutely.
And we even get a bit of a hint of that idea of social unrest spurred by Frankenstein's monster. The opening talks about fearful glances as if to step off the sidewalk, and people muttering about work being taken by stitched men. So, there is a certain hostile tone to the words "new mutterings of work taken by stitched men." It's not necessarily fear, it's resentment building up.
Right. Yeah, which goes into the other aspect of biopunk, the dystopia and the oppressive power structures. If you look at other works by Wildbow, you see things like the PRT, you see things like the Seal of Solomon, you see things like practitioner family dynamics. You see all of these power structures and some oppressive power structures, and some less oppressive, and some just bureaucratic, and Wildbow frequently exploring these ideas of how power is organized, how structure can be a benefit, and how it can also be a hindrance, and
lesser evil and whatnot.
Yeah. So I think that those two things, the monsters and the authorities, are the two themes that I keep seeing Wildbow come back to again and again and again. And these are baked directly into the genre that Twig takes place in.
Arguably more so even than the superhero setting or the urban fantasy horror setting.
Yeah.
Sure, both of those, have monsters and, the horror setting, but less so explicitly the concept of struggling against authority.
Yeah.
While, the
I would say
superhero
not even arguably. I think it's like,
Sure, yeah.
in a certain way, Wildbow's been writing biopunk this whole time, and just this is the first time he's admitted it.
Or, super punk and fantasy punk.
Yeah.
Though, I mean, not to spoil, but there certainly are very biopunky characters in Worm and even in Pact and Pale, I would say.
Yeah, that's true. That is definitely true. And that's one of the things we love about it.
For sure.
One of many. One other thing that, while we're on the topic of Twig compared to other Wildbow works,
sure,
this isn't a thematic thing or anything like that, but it's just like every time I'm reading a Wildbow work, they really just get huge.
True.
There gets to be a point, and it's happened in every other work, there gets to be a point where there's so much going on that I can no longer keep track in my head of like who's where and what's happened and blah, blah, blah. I am definitely expecting that to happen in Twig too. Hopefully, the more in-depth reading that we're doing will let us navigate that. But
that's absolutely something I'm also very interested in. Because, I read all the other Wildbow works much more casually than I am going to have to read this to be able to do it justice in a way that hopefully people enjoy listening to. Definitely have to have a deeper analysis than just this is cool that most of the rest of the stuff is read.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it is our podcast. We make the rules. We don't have to do anything like that. But
that is
I think
true.
We will because, we're both curious people, and
for sure.
We're definitely interested in learning more about all of these things that Wildbow is presenting before us. So I think we're going to do a bit of digging. There's a lot to find when you do.
Absolutely. So I'm very excited about doing this podcast, and I hope that some of you decide to follow along with us. I think we're getting towards the end of our notes here. Was there anything before we head into the final little bit that you wanted to talk about?
Go right ahead.
All right. So first, as just to keep both us and everybody else interested, one of the things that we want to do is discussion questions on a regular to semi-regular basis. I believe you had one planned, Dante.
Yes. So our discussion question for episode 0 is, without any spoilers, tell us what you want to hear from us in this podcast.
Yes, please no spoilers. Neither of us have read very far into Twig, and so we can't, have someone curating the answers. So we would very much appreciate you being kind to us.
Yes, but at the same time, we're new to this, and we're kind of making it up as we go. And if you have ideas that would make this podcast better, we definitely want to hear it.
And would appreciate it.
Yes. We're going to post this on Reddit, and that's where you can answer the discussion question.
Yep. So that's it for the first episode. We really hope you'll join us for this trip into Twig. And if you do, and even if you don't, please go to Wildbow's Patreon at patreon.com/Wildbow and support him. It's how he can produce all of these great stories and settings that we enjoy. And before we let you go, I've got a fun biology fact, and I'm going to try to do this every episode, but we will see. Apparently, humans have stripes. I'm presenting this information as someone with zero grounding in biology and very little research to validate, but Yeah, humans have stripes like zebras. We just normally cannot see them. They're called Blaschko's lines. And there are a number of different patterns that cover the whole body and generally trace the migration of embryonic stem cells in the fetus. So as our skin develops, different cells migrate and spread in different ways. And occasionally there are some ways that these cells can be expressed in different colors, but generally speaking, we normally cannot see them. However, apparently some cats can, or all cats can.
Interesting.
So, thank you very much.
Well, cats.
Go ahead.
Some cats also have stripes that you can't see.
Like and some that we can see.
A black cat. Well, some of them, yes, that you can see. But if you see a cat that doesn't have stripes, they pretty much do have stripes. It's just the stripes are the same color as the background.
I wonder whether cats can see the differences that we can't.
That is an interesting question.
So for our next episode, we'll cover 1.1 and 1.2 of Taking Root. And I believe normally we said we'd do this at a 2-week pace episode, but I think we had decided that we wanted to get our first one within a week of this introduction episode. So stay tuned. We look forward to doing this.
Talk to you later.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.